Picture a steel deck shuddering under a column of fire. The nose points into a pale wind, spray lifting off the bow, and a single-seat fighter hangs there, hands off the earth, held up by invisible math and roaring metal. The pilot's feet are firm on the pedals, but the aircraft will not forgive hesitation. The heat below could melt paint and blister skin. The slightest asymmetry can turn lift into tilt and tilt into tragedy. An instant later, the jet knifes forward, the flames bend, the wings bite the air, and the ship falls away behind. That moment, suspended between gravity and faith, is where the Yak-141 was designed to live. It was the Soviet bet that a frontline fighter could rise like a helicopter and then outrun its own shadow. A Cold War dare wrapped in titanium and kerosene, and a problem simple only on paper. How do you make vertical flight and supersonic flight share the same body without tearing it in half? Start with the promise. Soviet naval doctrine needed teeth at sea, but the big deck supercarriers never arrived. What they had was a class of carriers with ski jumps and limited deck space. Ships that demanded a fighter able to launch short, land vertical, and still fight like a real interceptor. The Harrier had proven the concept, but it wasn't a high-altitude, high-speed air defense thoroughbred. Moscow wanted both, so Yakovlev didn't just add a vectoring nozzle to a conventional jet. They rearranged the airplane around the physics of hover, then asked it to sprint. The result was a machine with two lives. In one life, it was a clean, aero-bodied aircraft with a powerful turbofan, narrow wings and a pointed nose that loved thin air. In the other, it was a balanced tripod of thrusts, balancing on columns of gas like a circus act, where the ground moves and the audience is salt water and exhaust. Subscribe now to get the rest of the Yak-141 series in the next comparisons. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the upcoming part. At rest, the Freestyle looks almost straightforward. Single engine in the rear, air intakes canted along the fuselage, a tall vertical tail and clipped wings perched high for deck clearance. The trick is what you don't see until the doors open. Behind the cockpit, buried like organs in a ribcage, sit two compact lift engines. They are passengers during cruise, dead weight you carry to win back a ship's deck. In hover, they become the front legs of the stool, spooling to life and pushing straight down through their own hinged doors in the spine and belly. The rear leg is the main engine, a high-thrust turbofan with a swiveling nozzle that can rotate downward for liftoff and back for flight, covering a wide arc so that the same motor that hurls you to Mach can also hold you 6 meters over steel. The cleverness here isn't just raw thrust, it's balance. The lift pair and the vectoring main must sit around the center of gravity like chess pieces arranged to prevent a topple. Fuel burns, weapons come off pylons, temperatures swing, yet the moment arms have to stay tame enough that a small command on the stick trims out the wobble. It's an engineering diet where every kilogram matters because every kilogram shifts the fulcrum. Hover is a brutal teacher. Wings need airflow, in hover there is none. So the Yak-141 breathes stability from reaction jets, little nozzles in the nose and wingtips that sip compressed air and puff control and pitch, yaw, and roll. Think of them as invisible fingertips, steadying a pencil balanced upright. Those puffs, the vector angle at the back, the lift engine's throttle, and the gyros all talk to a brain that was far from crude for its time, because the pilot alone cannot juggle that many plates, while a crosswind hits the ship and hot exhaust tries to recirculate into the intakes. Even the doors are choreography. Upper doors opening to feed the lift engine's cool air, lower doors shielding the belly from flame when the jets are pointed down, timed so that the machine doesn't inhale its own fire. Down in the hangars, they learned quickly that deck paint and heat are not friends. Up in the cockpit, they learned why an automatic ejection logic makes sense in a jet like this. If the nozzle is swung past a certain angle and the speed drops below a safe blur, the system arms itself. Lose control in that zone and the seat will punch the pilot free without waiting for second thoughts. It is both ominous and comforting. A silent acknowledgement that in vertical flight, the line between recoverable and too late can be a blink. Everything in the layout telegraphs the compromises. The lift engines are salvation at 0 knots and a penalty everywhere else. In cruise, they drink nothing but air and offer nothing but weight. That is why the planform stays tight and the structure slim. The main engine must make up for their drag and mass when the airplane goes hunting. When it does, the Freestyle becomes almost conventional again. The nozzle swings aft, the lift doors seal flush, the reaction jets go quiet, and the wing and tail start doing the honest work that any fighter understands. Numbers tell the story. A body around 18 meters long, wings just over 10, a weight empty a shade north of 11.5 tons, a maximum takeoff mass near 20. On good days and cold air, the machine could climb into the high teens of kilometers and push past Mach 1.5. Those aren't brochure dreams. They are the answer to the skeptic who says, VTOL is fine for a show, but can it fight? The Yak-141's answer was yes, if you treat vertical like a tool, not a lifestyle. But the math that grants miracles also charges interest. Hot gas ingestion, the tendency for your own exhaust to loop back into your intakes in a hovering plume, robs power right when you need it most. Deck turbulence adds noise to every sensor. A heavy landing can push struts through tanks because everything vertical happens close to the ground and close to the red line. Those are not theoretical footnotes. They explain why flight test cards carry conservative margins and why the ship's crew watches distance and wind with a zeal that borders on religious. They also hint at the quiet victory of the design, that it worked at all, repeatedly, under weather and workload, and the 1,000 variables that make sea operations messy. When the Freestyle rose over a ski jump, rotated its nozzle, tucked the extra engines to sleep, and broke away into blue air, it wasn't performing a party trick. It was proving that two incompatible worlds could be threaded through a single airframe if you choreographed the physics tightly enough. There's a human scale to all this. A pilot strapping into a jet that can hang in place knows the temptation to hover for the crowd and the necessity not to. Ground effect can bounce you. A gust can weather vane you. The lift engines demand clean air, and the main engine's exhaust has no patience for stray baggage carts. The value of vertical isn't spectacle. It's the freedom to come home to a moving postage stamp when fuel is thin and the pattern is crowded. That makes the early seconds of every sortie feel like a razor's edge decision. Commit to the rotation and go, or pause and feel the air, or add a little thrust to counter the ship's roll. Each of those micro choices sits on decades of equations drawn on late-night chalkboards and then hammered into aluminum and control laws, and finally, trust. If you want a single sentence to carry forward, carry this one. The Yak-141 wasn't a stunt, it was a system. A rear engine with a swiveling throat that could shove the horizon where it needed to be, twin lift engines waiting like coiled springs to shoulder the weight when wings could not, and a web of small jets whispering corrections the way a tightrope walker's pole dampens a tremor. It is the architecture of a compromise executed with enough precision to feel inevitable. And yet, as with every compromise, the bill comes due in places you can't ignore. Range, maintenance, thermal stress, the space it occupies in a ship's heartbeat. Understanding that balance is the key to everything that follows. Because next, we leave the theater of first impressions and step into the machinery itself, where doors open, shafts spin, valves breathe, and the choreography of vertical flight turns from poetry back into engineering. But the Yak-141 turns each line into a live negotiation. The moment the pilot selects vertical, the aircraft stops being a fast airplane and becomes a managed plume. Reaction control jets in the nose and wingtips begin to whisper, metering little puffs of compressed air to hold pitch, yaw, and roll in place while the main nozzle swings down and the twin lift engines wake up behind the cockpit. Those fingertips don't push much, they don't have to. They only steady the pencil that must stay perfectly vertical, while invisible gusts work to knock it off balance. What keeps the pencil steady is the control law choreographing everything that moves. Nozzle angle, lift engine throttle, reaction jets, even door timing. Because a hover is not a steady state. It is a controlled fall arrested 100 times per second. Door choreography sounds trivial until hot gas recirculation steals thrust right when you most need it. Upper doors have to open wide enough to feed the lift engines with clean air. Lower doors must shield the belly from the torch below. And all of them need to seal flush the instant you accelerate, or they become parasitic scoops. The airframe is a wind instrument. Bleed air is tapped, routed, and vented in patterns that keep temperatures survivable and flows predictable. Deck crews discovered early that vertical flight eats paint and patience. Heat-resistant coatings and safe zones are not decorations, but survival gear. Pilots discovered that hovering next to a ship is less about bravado and more about discipline. Minimize time in the hot zone, commit cleanly to transition, and never let the aircraft linger in a narrow band of speed and nozzle angle where a gust, a burble, or a momentary engine response lag can turn a controlled descent into a sag you cannot arrest. Inside the cockpit, the workload is deceptively light on the best day and savage on the worst. In calm air, the control law damps the jitters and the reaction jets trim away little tendencies to drift. The pilot scans engine instruments, keeps the velocity vector honest, watches deck motion, and feels for the signature vibration that means all three thrust columns are sharing the load. Add a crosswind across an angled deck, a touch of heave, and the wakes of another ship, and the same pilot works down a mental playbook at speed. Hold attitude with toes and wrist, feed a hint of extra throttle to the lift engines to stay out of the sink, lead the nozzle a degree sooner so the aircraft does not chase the deck, and keep the nose clear of the ship's island where hot air curls upward. None of this is theater. It is a sequence rehearsed until it looks effortless, because effort is exactly what you can't spare when everything is happening within a few meters of steel. Safety logic is built into the bones. Vertical flight in a single-seat fighter offers very few second chances, so the Yak's automatic ejection logic arms itself in a well-defined corner of the envelope, nozzle deflected, speed low, altitude unforgiving, ready to fire the seat if parameters tip into the unrecoverable. It's there for the moment everyone trains never to see. A hard landing that spikes loads through the gear, a sudden yaw from asymmetric thrust, a flame out where the lift engines were making the difference between weight and sky. The system is not a dare. It is a promise to families that a millisecond call will be made when a human cannot. That promise shapes behavior. Test cards are built with buffers, deck trials use conservative crosswind limits, and procedures are written around short, clean vertical segments rather than showy hovers. Navalization is more than hinges on a wing. Folding tips reduce footprint, but what matters as much is where the weight sits and how it moves. In a vertical landing, weapons expended and fuel burned shift the center of gravity forward and aft by centimeters that matter. The lift engines are placed to straddle that center so the thrust tripod still closes. Their doors are sculpted to keep ingestion at bay. The intakes for the main engine are canted to avoid swallowing the jet's own exhaust. The landing gear, seemingly mundane, is built to live under vertical loads that a conventional jet never sees. Struts, trunnions, attach fittings, things nobody notices, suddenly become critical paths in the maintenance schedule. This is the part of VTOL that is unglamorous and non-negotiable. If the ship can't turn the jet around, refuel it, cool it, and send it again without cooking decks or crew, the capability dies in the hangar. Performance numbers are never free. The headline that the aircraft could reach around Mach 1.7 at altitude sits next to the asterisk that vertical operations drink fuel with alarming appetite. A vertical takeoff, or even a short takeoff, followed by a vertical recovery, writes a different fuel story than a conventional launch and trap. Planning cells start to talk in terms of bring back, how much fuel and how many stores you can carry and still land vertically without running out of thrust margin as the deck rises to meet you. You can feel the compromise. The lift engines are heroes in the hover and ballast and cruise. The main engine must provide not only dash speed and climb, but also a generous surplus to pull you through the critical seconds of transition, when the wing is not lifting yet and the lift engines are still shouldering their share. In the climb, the airplane goes back to being what its shape promises: narrow, clean, relatively small wing loading for its class, and there it behaves like a fighter. But every mission plan quietly carries a tax that says, we had to carry our runway with us. If this helped you, hit subscribe. You'll get every new episode and can comment to help choose the next topic. Thermal management becomes its own operational art. On a hot day at sea level, thrust falls off, deck temperatures start high and climb higher with each jet in the stack, and the plume that looked tame in winter becomes a living thing that curls and bites. Crews mark heat shadows on the deck, cycle aircraft to alternate spots and meter departures, so one jet's exhaust does not poison another's intake. The airplane's systems help. Doors crack to vent, bleeds shift, and control laws ask for small sacrifices in nozzle angle or power to keep the flow laminar and the temperatures legal. The pilot learns the smell of hot salt and the look of a brown shimmer in the mirrors as cues every bit as real as a number on a gauge. All of this makes the milestones feel earned rather than staged. Conventional flight first, then a few heartbeats of true hover, then the full vertical transitions that prove the math can live outside a brochure. From there, the deck trials that look cinematic from afar and clinical up close because every touchdown is a data set and every clean departure is a small victory for anonymous engineers who spent nights putting slashes through uncertainties. And yet, even at its best, the system tells you where it hurts. Those lift engines that save the day also cost you range. Those doors that save the belly can bite you if they lag. The nozzle that gives you options steals volume and adds heat where heat is already a bully. The beauty is in the honesty. The aircraft never pretends the trade-offs aren't there. It shows you both lives, asks you to pick the one you need this minute, and promises to be coherent in both. This is where the story bends toward the inevitable comparison everyone wants to make. A machine that carries extra engines for the vertical phase is not the only way to solve the problem, and the West chose a different path when it wrapped a shaft-driven fan into the equation and split the rear nozzle into a clever, swiveling throat. Before we step into that fork in the road, hold the picture of the Yak's logic in your mind. 3 columns of thrust forming a stool, reaction jets sketching invisible lines, doors opening and closing in time with the pilot's pulse, and an ejection system that keeps its own counsel. Now imagine trying to deliver the same promise with different plumbing, different penalties, and different gifts. That is the hinge we turn on next. Put the Yak-141 next to the Western solution, and you can feel 2 schools of thought staring at the same cliff and choosing different ropes. The Soviet answer is immediate and literal. Add dedicated lift where wings cannot help, place 2 compact engines near the center of gravity to carry the nose, swivel the main nozzle to carry the tail, and let brute, well-balanced thrust do the rest. It is the elegance of a tripod. The Western answer that would crystallize later sets out to make one power plant do 2 jobs, siphoning torque forward to a vertical fan while a clever swiveling throat at the back bends the hot stream, and small ducts at the wings whisper steadiness. That is not a tripod so much as a lever system, translating shaft horsepower into cold mass flow and trading engines you carry all day for machinery you only spin when you must. Both paths keep a promise to the deck. They just pay in different currencies. Unpack the Yak's choice first. Dedicated lift engines are brutally honest in the hover. They spool fast, produce pure vertical thrust without complex gear trains, and give redundancy in the most unforgiving regime. If a gust rocks the nose, you have a front pair you can command without waiting for a mechanical clutch to bite or a long duct to pressurize. Ship motion, wind shear, minor sensor noise, even the slight bounce from deck effect, all of it can be absorbed by an arrangement that is spatially simple and dynamically responsive. But honesty is heavy. Once the aircraft tucks its doors and becomes a fighter again, those lift engines turn to stone in the cradle, burning range and payload as dead mass the moment you leave the vertical. Mission planners start measuring victories and bring back margin and fuel ladders. And maintainers quietly count cycles on components that only work for a few tense seconds per sortie, yet demand the pampering of a prima ballerina. The Western lift system that would define the F-35B flips the penalty. Instead of hauling 2 extra engines everywhere, it bolts a big vertical fan into the forward fuselage and drives it off the main core through a clutch and a shaft. Behind, a 3-bearing swiveling nozzle rotates the hot stream down, and small roll ducts in the wings exhale control. The gift here is cold mass flow. A fan moves a lot of air at lower temperature, which is kinder to decks, kinder to intakes, and more efficient at making lift per unit of fuel in the hover. The tax arrives as mechanical choreography. You must engage a clutch cleanly under heavy torque, spin a long shaft that does not care about your vibration budget, open large doors that become barn doors if they lag, and make sure the software marries all of this to the pilot's right hand without a hiccup. When it works, it is poetry in gearing. When it coughs, you feel every moving part in your bones. What makes the split feel inevitable is not ideology, but timing. The Yak-141 was a creature of the late Cold War, carrying the best control logic its generation could mass produce and the metallurgy its factories could afford, built for ships whose decks and hangars were already drawn and welded. The Western system matured a decade later in a world of faster processors, deeper sensor fusion, and budgets that could tolerate a drive system more complex than a city bus. Put simply, the Soviet path was a bet that weight you can see and touch is easier to certify than torque you cannot see, and that, in the hands of a pilot, simple thrust columns are safer than a symphony of shafts. The Western path was a bet that software would tame complexity and that a single engine doing double duty would pay back every kilogram of mechanism by giving you miles of range that you would otherwise leave on the table. Between those timelines sits a cooperation that keeps rumor mills humming. When the Soviet Union folded and design bureaus looked outward to survive, Western companies did what engineers always do when the lab door opens. They looked, they asked, they measured, and in some cases they paid to learn. Demonstrators toured air shows. Designers compared notes in hangars that smelled of kerosene and old paint. Test reports crossed desks, wearing stamps from offices that had never previously shared a coffee pot. From those months, you get a persistent myth that one airplane begat the other. Reality is less romantic and more interesting. Exposure to how the Yak managed doors, how it placed its lift around the center of gravity, how it armed its ejection logic when the nozzle swung past a certain angle, all of that is the kind of practical knowledge any serious program would hoard. But the Western choice to route torque to a vertical fan and to hinge the rear nozzle on 3 bearings was a separate fork in the road. Influence is not inheritance. It is a long shadow on the drafting table where someone writes in the margin, "Do not forget, hot gas recirculation bites harder than the wind tunnel suggests." If you want to see the fingerprints of the Yak in today's procedures, look where operations meet physics. Deck crews map heat like cartographers, painting keep-out zones where recirculation traps exhaust, cycling aircraft to avoid cooking the same spot twice, laying non-skid coatings that shrug at temperatures that would scare a road builder. Pilots train a muscle memory that keeps vertical segments short and crisp, that treats hover as a tool, not a parade, that knows the feel of a sink rate you cannot claw back, and respects the slow rhythm of ship heaved the way a drummer respects a click track. Engineers in both camps learned the same hard lesson. Door timing is not an animation, but a performance with consequences. A lower door that lingers becomes a scoop and a flame holder. An upper door that hesitates starves a lift path. A missequenced set can make a normal transition look like a trap door opening under your feet. There's also the quieter legacy, the one you only notice in the way pilots talk about vertical flight. They speak less of heroics and more of margins. They talk about the smell that says you're too close to your own wake, about the shimmer of heat in a mirror that means the plume is curling back, about the way a ship's island throws a standing wave of warm air when the breeze crosses it. That language was sharpened by every program that dared to hang a fighter in space for seconds at a time. The Yak-141 sharpened it in a world where tolerances were tight and money was tighter, and proved that a supersonic airframe could be honest about its compromises and still be coherent in both lives it had to live. The final measure of any architecture is whether it gives the fleet choices without painting them into a corner. On that score, the Soviet and Western answers both succeed, but in different ways. The Yak makes the deck a shorter walk at the price of hauling iron everywhere you go. The Western fan makes the hover kinder to fuel and steel at the price of complexity under your feet. Neither is free. Both are virtuoso performances of the same theme scored for different instruments. What matters to us now, as we step into the next chapter, is that we hold those trade-offs in our head while we put cutaways side by side and trace actual flows and forces through real hardware. We will follow the air from intake to door, watch shafts bite and nozzles turn, and let the shapes tell us why each team drew the lines it did. Only then does the comparison stop being myth and become mechanics, and only then does the legacy stop being a headline and become a map you can fly.